Hello, and welcome to my channel Stories of Injustice. She walked into her courthouse like she did every morning, confident, respected, untouchable. But minutes later, she was being held down by officers, and her hair, her crown, was being shaved off. The crime? Being a black woman they didn't recognize in power. This is the true story of what happened when a federal judge was humiliated by those sworn to uphold the law, and how she turned that act of racism into a nationwide reckoning. From courtroom power plays to criminal convictions, you're about to witness how one woman fought back, not with rage, but with the full weight of justice. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and how far you'd go to stand up for what's right. And trust us, don't skip the ending. It's not just powerful, it changes everything. It started like any other day. Cool air hung over Charleston, thick with the scent of the Atlantic, and the early light slanted through Spanish moss as if the sun itself were still deciding whether to rise. The federal courthouse loomed above Meeting Street like a stone sentinel, grand, quiet, imposing. Celeste Monroe stepped out of her silver Buick, heels clicking against the pavement. Her posture was composed, spine straight, her expression unreadable beneath the calm mask she had spent decades perfecting. Her tailored navy blazer hugged her shoulders, her slacks pressed to precision, and her twisted silver locks were coiled tight against her scalp, dignified, deliberate, and unapologetically her. She was a woman who had spent her life navigating rooms not built for her. And she'd risen, through law school, clerkships, years of federal service, to one of the most powerful positions in the region, a federal judge presiding over civil rights cases in one of the South's most complex legal battlegrounds. But she never entered the courthouse in her robe. She preferred to arrive like any other citizen. No entourage, no preamble. Just a woman with a nameplate on her office door and a fire in her chest that hadn't dimmed since she'd argued her first case. That morning, she carried only her slim leather portfolio, walking with steady purpose toward the marble steps that had carried hundreds of defendants, attorneys, officers, and families before her. Her court calendar was heavy. A police misconduct case was on the docket, a high-profile incident involving local officers, and a disabled veteran injured during a peaceful demonstration. The media would be there. Advocates too. But she didn't dwell on that. Her focus was on the facts, on process, on justice. At the security checkpoint, however, the air shifted. It was subtle at first. A pause. A narrowing of eyes. Deputy Hank Riker stood at the front of the checkpoint, thick arms crossed, a gloved hand resting just above his duty belt. He was known around the courthouse. Been there for years. Kept to the old ways, as some put it. He didn't recognize her. And more importantly, he didn't care to. Celeste stepped forward calmly, preparing to offer her ID. "Ma'am," Riker said flatly, lifting one hand to stop her. "Gonna need you to step out of line." Her brow furrowed. "Is there a problem, officer?" He looked her up and down with casual authority. Not rude, just dismissive. She wore no robe, no visible badge of office. To him, she was just another woman in line. Just another black woman with a sharp suit and too much confidence. "No ID displayed," he said, voice low but firm. "You can't just waltz into a federal building looking like that." Celeste calmly reached into her blazer and retrieved her credentials. A federal badge, clean and current. She held it out for him to see. He barely glanced at it before snatching it from her hand. Slipped it into his pocket like a bus ticket. "I'd like that returned," she said, voice still measured. He took a step closer. "You in a rush to get somewhere, sweetheart?" The word hit like a slap. She felt it in her gut, heard it in every syllable. Behind her, the line grew still. A young woman in a court staff uniform looked up sharply from her tablet, then looked away just as quickly. "I need to get to a courtroom," Celeste replied evenly. Riker gave a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll follow my procedure. Random checks. Let's go." He gestured toward a side hallway. She didn't move. "I don't consent to this. You're acting suspicious." And that was all it took. With one heavy hand on her upper arm, Riker steered her away from the foot traffic, into the hallway, toward a side door that led not to the public courtrooms, but to a screening room she had never once needed to enter, not in all her years presiding here. It was windowless, cool, silent. The air hung heavy with the hum of fluorescent lights. There was a steel chair in the middle, a rolling cart beside it, clamps, scanners, and on the edge of the table, a pair of clippers. Celeste's heart kicked once in her chest. "I'm not resisting," she said quietly. "And you have no legal cause to detain me." Riker motioned to the chair. "Sit." She didn't. Not yet. The clippers buzzed to life with a sound that made Celeste's stomach tighten. It wasn't the hum itself, it was what it represented. The start of something deliberate, something cruel, something irreversible. Deputy Hank Riker grinned as he tested the clippers against his palm, like a mechanic checking a tool he already knew was sharp. Just standard procedure, he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. Can't be too careful these days. Celeste Monroe remained seated, only because the two officers gripping her arms had forced her into the steel chair moments before. Her blazer had been pulled tight around her shoulders in the scuffle, creased in a way that exposed the slight tremble of her muscles. She wasn't shaking from fear. Not quite. It was something heavier than fear. It was rage, coiled and quiet, held down by the gravity of every courtroom oath she'd ever taken. You don't have to do this, she said, voice even. Riker didn't answer. He just took a step forward and tilted her head with the flat of his palm, like she was a mannequin. You want to do the honors? He asked the younger officer. Might be your only shot at touching real silver. The officer, a man barely in his 30s, eyes darting with nervous energy, half laughed, half coughed. He didn't move. Riker clicked his tongue. Suit yourself. You millennials are soft. Back in the day, we didn't ask questions, we got the job done. Celeste's breath caught when the blades touched her scalp. The first lock fell. It hit the floor with a soft, terrible sound, like a ribbon dropped at a funeral. She didn't flinch. But inside, something tore. You know, Riker said as he guided the clippers around the crown of her head, I've always wondered what women like you hide in these things. Drugs? Knives? State secrets. Another lock tumbled. Then another. Or maybe it's just attitude, huh? He laughed, glancing at the others. Wrap it all up in your hair so you can strut around like you built the courthouse instead of just walking through it. Please, Celeste said quietly, stop. But he didn't. I bet you think this is harassment, he said, leaning down so she could smell the coffee on his breath. But this? This is just hygiene. You know what hygiene is, right? One of the officers snorted. Riker straightened. You ever see those jungle documentaries? The ones with the tribes and the face paint? That's what this reminds me of. The younger officer chuckled nervously. She ain't saying much now, the other one muttered. She's used to giving orders, Riker said, not following them. Celeste stared at the wall, at the shadows cast by the flickering fluorescent lights, at the steel table where her badge still lay, untouched, discarded like it meant nothing. The clippers scraped closer to her temple now, where her locks had grown thickest. She felt the vibration through her skull, dull and cruel. The cold breeze of the air conditioning hit the fresh, raw skin left behind. Her head itched, burned, but she didn't raise a hand. She didn't cry out. She just watched the floor as more of her hair piled in uneven coils, silver, black, a lifetime of identity reduced to garbage. You know what this is, sweetheart? Riker asked, finally stepping back. She didn't answer. He reached down and picked up a thick lock from the floor, holding it between two fingers like it was something spoiled. This is a message. We don't care who you think you are. He dropped it back to the floor. You got your fancy blazer, your little badge, your federal credentials. But none of that matters in here. In here, I'm the law. The room was silent, except for the whine of the clippers winding down. Celeste breathed in deeply, the scent of disinfectant and old carpet settling in her lungs. Her head felt colder now. Lighter, but not in any way that felt freeing. It felt like something had been taken, piece by piece, without permission, without care. Now you look normal, one officer muttered behind her. Like everybody else? No, Riker said, eyes hard. Now she looks like someone who finally learned her place. Celeste rose from the chair. Slowly. The air touched the raw skin behind her ears, made her blink from the sudden sting. But her legs were steady, her back straight. Riker tossed a tissue toward her feet. You missed a spot. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she walked to the table and took her badge. Held it for a moment, then placed it gently back in her blazer pocket. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the door. Her footsteps echoed softly against the tile, each one measured, like punctuation in a closing argument. No one spoke. No one stopped her. They'd done what they wanted, and they thought that was the end. But Celeste knew better. Because when you strip someone of everything, what's left is purpose. And hers was just beginning. Celeste didn't look back. She stepped out of the screening room, the door closing behind her with a soft click that felt louder than a gunshot in the silence of the hallway. The light in the corridor seemed brighter now, almost harsh. Every tile, every echo of her heels against the floor felt exaggerated, like the building itself was watching her, judging her. Her scalp tingled where her silver locks had once draped proudly. What remained was uneven, raw, a brutal contrast to the deliberate perfection she had crafted that morning. The pride she took in her appearance had never been vanity. It had been armor, and now they'd torn it off. She passed a janitor pushing a cart, an older black man who nodded politely, then froze as his eyes met hers. His gaze dropped to the patches of exposed scalp. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was reverent, like a moment of grief. He said nothing, but his hand gripped the mop handle a little tighter as she passed. Further down the corridor, two junior clerks stood near the elevators, chatting quietly. The taller one caught sight of Celeste first. Her eyes widened, words dying in her throat. The other turned to look, then immediately looked away. The hush that followed them down the hall was thick with knowing. They had heard, maybe even seen, but they said nothing. Celeste's steps didn't slow. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not yet. Courtroom 2A loomed at the end of the hall, tall wooden double doors that always reminded her of church pews. It was already packed inside. She could hear the murmur of conversation through the thick paneling. A press conference earlier that week had guaranteed the attention. The case, Briggs versus Charleston PD, was set to be the most publicized civil rights hearing of the year. She was supposed to enter through chambers. Staff had prepped her robe, her chair, her docket, everything waiting neatly behind the scenes for her arrival. But today, the performance didn't matter. The doors swung open. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. And then came the silence, the kind that doesn't settle so much as it lands. Heavy, absolute, unignorable. Celeste stepped into the courtroom like a storm rolling in. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the rows of stunned faces. Journalists with pens frozen mid-note. Plaintiffs and defendants with eyes locked on her like she was a ghost. No one said a word. Not at first. Her shoes echoed against the marble as she passed. The judge's bench stood ahead, elevated, polished, stately. The seat at its center still empty. Her seat. She reached it slowly, then stopped. The courtroom was still as death. To her right, a group of uniformed officers sat at the defense table. Two of them had badges visible on their belts. One, a sergeant with thinning hair and a jaw clenched too tight, stared at her with a look that couldn't decide if it was confusion or contempt. Another, a young officer barely out of his academy years, dropped his eyes. To her left, a row of advocates and attorneys sat at the plaintiff's table. Among them was Howard Briggs, the father of the disabled veteran who'd been injured during a peaceful protest. A working-class man with thick hands and tired eyes. He stared at Celeste not with shock, but with recognition. Like he saw her. Not the judge, not the scalp, but the truth behind it. She turned. Her hand reached for the robe draped over the arm of her chair. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait for ceremony. With one motion, she slipped it on, shoulder to shoulder, stitch by stitch, until it hung like steel across her frame. No one moved. No one breathed. And then, "Is the docket ready?" she asked, her voice sharp as glass. The court clerk, young, visibly shaken, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste nodded once, then took her seat. The leather groaned softly beneath her as she settled into the bench. Only then did she let her eyes scan the room. She saw the glances, the whispers, the pity, the doubt. She saw Deputy Hank Riker, still standing at the side door where he was assigned, still wearing the smug look that had accompanied him through years of unchecked power. But his eyes betrayed something new. Recognition. And something worse. Fear. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't imagined she would walk straight into the courtroom after what he'd done, let alone take her place on the bench. But here she was, sitting taller than ever. The courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like the moment before lightning strikes. And the air? It was thick with what was coming next. The courtroom was still under her command, but Celeste could feel the weight of the room pressing in. Her scalp still tingled where the clippers had scraped bare skin. A breeze from the overhead fan caught the rawness of it and sent a cold shiver down her spine. She didn't move. Her robe, thick, black, heavy, settled over her shoulders like a mantle of purpose. It hid the damage, but not the memory. That lingered. Everyone was seated now, though no one had been told to sit. The collective hush had given way to a cautious quiet, the kind that follows a deep, public wound. Celeste could feel the gazes on her. Reporters, attorneys, court officers. Some were sympathetic. Some were embarrassed. And some, like Deputy Riker standing by the side wall, were afraid. He still hadn't moved. She saw the way his jaw tightened every time she glanced his way. The way his hand hovered near his belt, like instinct had taken over and his body hadn't yet caught up with reality. He looked at her like she was something unexpected, something dangerous. He was right. "We will begin today," Celeste said, her voice steady, "with preliminary testimony in Case 2371F, United States versus Charleston Police Department." A rustle passed through the courtroom. She waited. Charges include excessive force, violation of civil rights, and misconduct under color of law. Her gaze scanned the defense table. No one spoke. All parties present? The plaintiff's attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste gave a nod. "Call your first witness." The room shifted slightly. Shoulders relaxed. Pins moved. The gears of legal ritual began to turn. But beneath the surface, tension still burned. The first witness was Howard Briggs. He stood slowly from the pew and walked to the front like a man carrying something far heavier than his own weight. The bailiff, thankfully not Riker, guided him to the stand. Briggs was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with hands like concrete blocks. He was the kind of man who looked out of place in a courtroom, not because of anything lacking, but because his life had been spent in warehouses, not hearings. His eyes were tired, his voice low. He raised his right hand, swore the oath. Then he sat. "Mr. Briggs," the plaintiff's attorney began, "can you tell the court what happened on the evening of June 14th? Howard nodded, cleared his throat, and spoke. "My son, Marcus, was at a protest. Peaceful, holding a sign. The cops told him to move. He didn't move fast enough, I guess." He paused. One of them hit him in the back of the leg with a baton. He fell. Another officer knelt on his back. He couldn't breathe. We were screaming for them to stop. Celeste's hand tightened around her pen. Howard continued. "They told us he was faking it. Said he was trying to make them look bad. My boy, he's 17. He still calls me when he gets nervous before a math test." The courtroom was silent again. But this time, it wasn't confusion holding it still. It was anger. Howard looked up, his voice cracking. "He still can't speak right. Can't go outside without flinching at sirens." "Thank you," the attorney said. "No further questions." Celeste nodded. "Defense?" A lawyer in a tailored gray suit rose. His face was taut, and his voice too polished to sound sincere. "No questions at this time, Your Honor. Witness is dismissed." Howard stood slowly and walked past the defense table. He didn't look at the officers seated there, but his shoulders straightened slightly as he passed. Celeste watched him go. And then, only then, did she look at Riker. He was still by the side door, pale now, jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck twitched. She spoke. "Deputy Hank Riker." His name snapped through the courtroom like a switchblade. He blinked. "Your Honor." Her tone didn't change. "Step forward." A murmur moved through the gallery. Riker hesitated, just for a second. Then he walked stiffly toward the open space before the bench. "State your full name for the record." He hesitated. "Hank Riker." Louder. He swallowed. "Hank Gerald Riker." "How long have you served as a court officer in this district?" 14 years, he said. The confidence was cracking. Celeste leaned forward slightly. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you escorted into that screening room?" He looked at her, then away. I don't know." "You don't know?" she asked. Her voice was calm, deceptively so. "I don't keep count," he muttered. "Let me help you," she said. 12 formal complaints. All buried. All dismissed. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Riker's mouth opened. No words came out. Celeste stood. The robe fell into place with a rustle like thunder. "This morning," she said, her voice echoing now, "you assaulted a federal judge. You humiliated her. You violated your oath and the laws of this court." Riker took a step back. The room was breathless. "Effective immediately," Celeste continued, "you were relieved of duty and placed under investigation. Officers, escort him out." 2 bailiffs moved. Not quickly. Not angrily. Just with quiet authority. Riker protested, but the room wasn't listening anymore. No one was. Because justice, real justice, was no longer theoretical. It was here. And it had a voice. The double doors to courtroom 2A swung closed behind Deputy Hank Riker, flanked by 2 silent officers who barely looked at him as they walked. For a moment, the sound of those doors echoed like the closing of a vault, one that had locked away a piece of a system that for too long had gone unchecked. Inside, the room sat in stunned quiet, not just because of what had happened, but because of what it meant. Celeste Monroe stood behind the bench, both hands resting on the polished wood, her gaze sweeping across every person in that room. Her robe, slightly uneven from the rush, still carried its symbolic weight. And beneath it, her head, bare, shorn, marked by a crime no one had expected to witness, was now a crown. She hadn't planned to do this. Not like this. But the moment had chosen her. She looked to the clerk. Next witness. The young woman, still wide-eyed, cleared her throat and shuffled her papers. Yes, Your Honor. Officer Liam Tate, please step forward. Tate, a 30-year-old patrolman with close-cropped hair and nervous hands, rose slowly from the defense table. He moved like a man walking across a frozen lake, uncertain which step might crack the ice. He took the stand, swore the oath, and sat down with a stiffness that didn't match the badge on his chest. The plaintiff's attorney approached. Officer Tate, you were present at the protest where Mr. Briggs' son was injured? Yes, Tate replied. His voice was low. Did you witness the incident in question? A pause. Yes. And in your report, did you mention the use of force by your fellow officers? Another pause. I didn't include every detail. Why not? Tate's eyes flicked to the defense table, then to Celeste. And something in her gaze, something rooted not in anger but in expectation, held him there. Because, he said slowly, we're told to protect the department first. Always. Gasps echoed. The judge didn't move. Are you saying you were instructed not to report misconduct? I'm saying, Tate said, eyes lowering. It's understood. The attorney stepped back. No further questions. Celeste looked at him. And not as a judge. Not as an adversary. But as a witness to something deeper than one protest. You can step down, she said. Tate nodded and walked quickly back to his seat. As he passed his fellow officers, none met his eyes. The air in the courtroom was different now. No longer stunned. Now unsettled. The mask was slipping, not just on the officers, but on the institution itself. People were watching differently. Leaning in. Not to hear, but to understand. And some of them, for the first time, were beginning to. Celeste leaned forward again. Court will recess for 20 minutes. She rose, turned, and walked toward her chambers. She could feel the pressure behind her. Eyes, voices, the buzz of people whispering into phones, texting updates, snapping notes that would become headlines by sundown. But as the door closed behind her, the silence came rushing back. Her chambers were still, immaculate. The robe hung heavy on her shoulders. She reached up and gently pulled it off, folding it over the back of her chair. She stepped toward the mirror above the wash basin. And she looked. The woman in the glass wasn't a judge right now. She was someone who had just been violated, humiliated, stripped. Her scalp still bore the redness from the clippers. Her once orderly locks, now gone, lived only in memory and on the cold tile floor of a screening room that would never see her again. Her hands trembled slightly. She pressed her palms to the edge of the sink and exhaled. Then there was a knock. She didn't turn. Come in. It was her clerk. Your Honor, there's someone here who asked to see you. Said she witnessed what happened this morning. She's an intern. Celeste blinked at her own reflection. Send her in. The door opened. A young woman stepped in, maybe early 20s, glasses slipping down her nose, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. I'm sorry to bother you, she said quickly. I saw it. This morning. I was by the checkpoint. I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. Celeste turned, held up a hand. You're here now. The young woman swallowed hard. If you need me to testify, I will. Silence passed between them. Then, Celeste stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her arm. Thank you. The girl blinked fast, nodded, then turned and left. The door closed again. Celeste exhaled. There was still so much to do. So many names, so many silences waiting to be broken. But the crack had started. And cracks don't close. They spread. The courthouse had changed. Word of what had happened in courtroom 2A was spreading fast, faster than any docket, faster than the wheels of justice usually turned. By the time Celeste returned from chambers, a second line of reporters had formed just outside the lobby doors. Camera crews with long lenses and directional mics crowded under the rotunda, their whispers rising with the echo of their ambition. They weren't there for the case. They were there for her. The judge with the shorn scalp. The federal official who'd been attacked in her own courthouse. The story was no longer local. It had crossed city lines, state lines, and now the federal press pool was circling, sniffing out every detail. Inside the courtroom, it was quieter, but only on the surface. Celeste resumed her seat. The clerk called the room back to order. Everyone stood, then sat. The defense attorney stood. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his composure was fraying. His client, Sergeant Douglas Quinn, one of the officers involved in the Briggs incident, had grown visibly uneasy during testimony. His arms folded too tightly. His fingers tapped the table like they were searching for a trigger. "Your Honor," the attorney began, "before we continue, I'd like to request a brief sidebar." Celeste regarded him coolly. "On what grounds?" He cleared his throat. "We've received word that portions of this trial may be compromised. A potential conflict of interest." She blinked. "Clarify." The attorney's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's come to our attention that the presiding judge," he chose his words carefully, "has been involved in an incident this morning which may cast doubt on her ability to proceed impartially." A hush fell. Celeste didn't flinch. "You're referring to the assault I experienced inside this courthouse," she said. "I'm referring," he replied, "to the perception of bias it creates. The fact that it involved an officer of the court, and that the media attention surrounding it may influence these proceedings." There it was. The first ripple of resistance. Not from a street corner protester, but from inside the system. From the machinery that had long protected itself by attacking those who dared call it out. Celeste leaned back slightly. Her voice, when it came, was ice. "I assure the court that I can remain impartial. But if the defense wishes to challenge my fitness to preside, you may submit a formal motion for recusal. In writing. With supporting evidence." The attorney hesitated. "Otherwise," she continued, "I suggest we proceed." He sat down. Tension held the room in place like glue. The next witness was called. Detective Carla Monroe, no relation, walked in wearing a dark pantsuit and a badge clipped to her belt. She was Internal Affairs, assigned to review the use of force reports from the night of the protest. She took the stand, raised her right hand, and swore in. "Detective Monroe," the plaintiff's attorney began, "did your office receive any body camera footage from the officers involved?" "We received footage from 2 of the 6 officers assigned to that protest," she said. "And the others?" "Reported technical failure." Laughter, bitter and short, rippled from the gallery. Celeste didn't smile. "Were any internal complaints filed against those officers following the incident?" "Yes," Monroe replied. "For complaints. 3 from bystanders. 1 anonymous." "Were those complaints investigated?" "No." "Why not?" "Because Judge Harwood declined to issue subpoenas for evidence review. And because Sergeant Quinn," she glanced toward the defense table, "cited a standing departmental exemption for emergency operations." Celeste's pen stopped moving. Harwood. A name she knew. A judge with tenure nearly as long as hers. A man known for his courtroom control and for the friendships he cultivated behind closed doors. "Thank you," the attorney said. The defense declined to cross-examine. Celeste watched the pieces beginning to align, imperfectly, but unmistakably. The protest. The force. The buried footage. The friendly judge. And now, the pressure on her to step down. When the witness stepped down, Celeste called for another short recess. As she walked back into chambers, her clerk followed with an envelope in hand. "This just came, Your Honor." Marked confidential. Celeste opened it carefully. Inside was a sealed motion, filed not by the defense, but by a third party, the Office of Judicial Oversight. She scanned it quickly. A review panel was being assembled. An anonymous tip had prompted a preliminary investigation into her conduct. They cited possible judicial overreach and compromising behavior during security protocols. It didn't say who filed the tip, but she knew. This wasn't about the case anymore. This was about power, about sending a message. She was becoming dangerous, and the machine was beginning to push back. She closed the folder, looked out the window of her chambers, and knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they thought she would break quietly, they had mistaken the target. Again. By the next morning, the temperature in Charleston had risen by more than just degrees. The courthouse sat under a different kind of sky, gray and watchful, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Inside, the tone had shifted from tension to calculation. The pressure that had built up over 2 days was now tilting the scales, slowly, but visibly. Celeste arrived through a private side entrance this time. Not because she feared another ambush, but because, overnight, federal agents had been stationed discreetly around the courthouse. A quiet directive had been issued from Washington. Civil rights units were watching. So was the press. Deputy Hank Riker didn't return to the building. He didn't get the chance. An emergency hearing had been convened that morning, led by the Regional Ethics Board. Witness statements were taken. Security footage previously marked corrupted was suddenly recovered and submitted into evidence. And by 9 a.m., Riker was officially charged with felony assault, civil rights violations under Title 18, and obstruction of justice. His name was already circulating in headlines across the country. At home, some locals defended him, claiming confusion. Others knew better. They'd seen this pattern before, just not so publicly broken. He was booked without bail. Celeste didn't watch the coverage. She didn't need to. Justice wasn't a performance. It was process. And it had just begun. Inside the courtroom, Sergeant Douglas Quinn, the senior officer in the Briggs incident, was no longer postured with arrogance. The mounting testimonies, the appearance of IA Detective Monroe, and now whispers that body cam footage might be restored had cracked his defense. A new prosecutor had joined the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney Natalie Wong, dispatched from Atlanta. She sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, watching every word, every flinch, every inconsistency. Celeste noticed her but said nothing. She didn't need to. What began as a civil case was now shifting toward criminal exposure. Celeste presided as if nothing had changed. Her hair remained uneven, unhidden. If anyone in the room hoped she might cloak the evidence of her humiliation beneath a wig or scarf, they were disappointed. Her presence had become its own verdict. "Next witness," she said, her voice calm but commanding. Jason Ford, a city employee who'd been working traffic control the night of the protest, took the stand. He was reluctant at first, but when asked about the officer's behavior, he surprised the room. "I saw one of them high-five the other after they took that boy down," he said, voice cracking. Like it was a joke. The room shifted again. Celeste's pen didn't pause this time. She looked down, made a note, and beside her on the bench, a sealed file sat unopened, marked with the seal of the Department of Justice. She already knew what it said. 2 federal investigations were now officially underway, one into the Charleston Police Department's use of force over the past 5 years, the other into the circuit court's pattern of suppressing civil complaints. Neither would be fast, but neither would stop. The system had awakened, and what had once been invisible, cloaked in silence, denial, and ritual, was now being pulled, inch by inch, into the light. Celeste adjourned court just after 3 p.m. As the room emptied, she sat alone for a moment longer, her hands resting on the arms of her chair, the noise fading behind her. She didn't feel triumph. Not yet. Just motion. Forward, for once. Then, a soft knock. It was her clerk. "Your Honor," she said gently. "There's someone here to see you. A man named Briggs. Howard Briggs." Celeste looked up. "Send him in." The door opened, and the man who had once sat trembling at the plaintiff's table stepped forward. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "Not for ruling. Just for listening." Celeste stood. Walked over. "You gave your son a voice," she said. Briggs nodded. Then added, "It's not just your courtroom anymore. It's ours, now." He left before she could respond. But he was right. By the time the formal criminal proceedings began, Charleston was no longer the only city watching. National networks had parked satellite trucks along Calhoun Street. Pundits debated her image. Social media timelines looped clips of her entering the courthouse each morning with her uneven hair, eyes sharp, posture fixed like stone. To some, she was a hero. To others, a disruption. But none could look away. Celeste Monroe had become the embodiment of a question America still couldn't answer. What happens when power is forced to confront its reflection? The U.S. District Court convened at 10 a.m. sharp. Celeste walked in wearing her robe as always, but there was a new stillness in the room. Not silence stillness. Even the walls felt more alert. Deputy Hank Riker had already taken a plea. He had stood, without the swagger, without the smirk, in a different courtroom 2 floors below, where federal prosecutors had offered a narrow path forward: full confession, public admission, and permanent relinquishment of any position of public trust. In exchange, reduced prison time. He agreed. He had no choice. On paper, he would serve 6 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, assault under color of law, and obstruction. But the true sentence had already begun the moment his mugshot hit the evening news, clean-shaven, orange jumpsuit, stripped of the badge he once believed protected him. His name was already being removed from courthouse rosters. But it wasn't over. Today, Judge Monroe would sentence the remaining 2 officers charged in the Briggs case, Sergeant Douglas Quinn and Officer Ben Foster. Both had been found guilty the previous week by a jury that needed just 4 hours of deliberation. Quinn had laughed as a 17-year-old boy begged for breath. Foster had stood watch, doing nothing, as his partner's knee crushed the boy's ribs. Both had filed pre-sentencing motions pleading for leniency. Neither would receive it. Celeste looked out across the courtroom. To wear a badge, she began, her voice quiet but steady, is not just a privilege. It is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is abandoned, when it becomes a weapon instead of a shield, this court must respond. Foster stared at the floor. Quinn didn't move. You injured a child. You mocked him. You falsified reports. And you relied on the silence of a system you assumed would always protect you. She paused. That silence is broken. She turned first to Foster. For your role in the assault and your failure to intervene, you are sentenced to 7 years in federal prison without parole. You will be permanently barred from holding any position in law enforcement. Then to Quinn. For your role in the assault, the falsification of official documents, and the abuse of your authority under color of law, you are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. A gasp moved through the room. Your badge no longer protects you. Your rank no longer shields you. You are no longer an officer of the law. You are a convicted felon. Neither man spoke. The gavel fell. Bailiffs moved in. Foster stood without resistance. Quinn hesitated, but ultimately followed. The sound of chains tightening around their wrists echoed through the courtroom like a slow heartbeat. Celeste remained still. The courtroom emptied slowly. Victims' families lingered in the pews. Reporters rushed to file headlines. Some officers left without speaking. Others offered quiet nods. She stayed until the room was nearly empty. Only then did she rise. And for the first time in months, her steps felt lighter. Not because justice had been fully served, but because the weight of silence had been replaced by something else. Accountability. And it had a pulse now. The courthouse was quiet again. Not just in sound, but in energy. The spotlight had begun to move on. News trucks now idled more than they filmed. Pundits turned their attention to news scandals. The noise, once deafening, had begun to fade into a dull background hum. But inside Celeste Monroe's chambers, the silence remained full. Heavy. Restless. The cases were done. Sentences had been delivered. The paper trail was long and exacting. But justice, as Celeste knew too well, didn't always bring closure. She stood in front of the small mirror above her wash basin, staring at her reflection. The hair hadn't grown much, just a shadow across her scalp now, stubborn and uneven. She hadn't touched it. Not yet. Part of her wanted to let it grow wild and undisturbed. Another part wanted to keep it short, to carry the mark until the world remembered why it was there. She hadn't decided. Outside her chambers, the courthouse buzzed softly with end-of-day rhythms, clerks shuffling papers, phones chirping in distant offices, the closing click of heavy doors. A knock interrupted the quiet. She turned. Come in. It was her clerk. Your Honor, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. Said you'd know who he was. She raised an eyebrow. He said his name is Lawrence Riker. A beat passed. Send him in, she said. The door opened. He stepped inside, mid-50s, tall, graying at the temples. A suit that had seen better days. A small limp in his left leg. His face was hard to read, not regretful, not defiant. Just steady. Celeste said nothing. You don't know me, he began, but I'm Hank's older brother. She nodded once. I figured. He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from her desk. I'm not here to defend him. I'm not even here to explain him. What he did was wrong. Evil, even. I saw the footage. I read the charges. That was no brother of mine. Still, Celeste said nothing. But I am here for another reason. She folded her hands. Go on. Lawrence reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box, plain, brown, wrapped in simple twine. He set it gently on her desk. This belonged to her mother. She was a teacher. Civil rights era. Selma, Montgomery, all of it. She'd have smacked him for what he did. And I think maybe she'd want you to have this. Celeste hesitated, then slowly opened the box. Inside was a pin, gold-plated. A small, elegant piece shaped like a quill crossed over a book. The symbol of an educator. A woman who believed in truth, even when the world tried to bury it. She gave that to me when I became a teacher, he said. I retired last year. Never thought I'd feel ashamed of my family name. But here we are. Celeste studied the pin. Simple. Earnest. What do you want from me? She asked finally. Nothing, Lawrence replied. Just to say that not all of us are what he was. And to say thank you. For standing up when others would have folded. She looked at him. Really looked. A man carrying a different kind of weight. A witness to what happens when silence turns into complicity and someone finally breaks it. She nodded once. Thank you for saying that. He turned to leave, paused at the door. "And Judge, I hope you never forget what you've done here." "I won't," she said. He left. And for a while, Celeste sat alone with the pin resting in her palm, the quiet wrapping around her like a second rope. Outside, the city moved on. But inside, the story wasn't over. It was changing. And for the first time in a long while, it was hers to tell. 3 weeks had passed. The courtrooms no longer echoed with the heavy silence that once followed every glance toward Judge Celeste Monroe. The cameras were gone. The reporters had found new headlines. Even the politicians, who had once chosen their words so carefully, were now speaking of reform, transparency, and accountability as if none of it had ever touched them personally. But Celeste hadn't changed. She arrived each day as she always had. Same steps, same stride, the same calm certainty in her eyes. Her hair had begun to grow back, short, uneven curls, silver like ash after a storm. She didn't hide them. She didn't try to restore her image. Instead, her appearance had become a statement. "I survived. And I'm still here." One morning, just as the city was waking up, she stepped onto the balcony outside her chambers, a narrow little ledge above the courtyard. Below, near the courthouse steps, stood a group of school children. A field trip. Their teacher pointed up at the building, explaining the justice system. Some kids yawned. Others debated excitedly whether they'd get to see a real judge. One girl, maybe 11, stood slightly apart from the group. Her eyes drifted upward and locked with Celeste's. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then the girl smiled. Not wide, but real. Celeste nodded. And she understood, in that instant, what it was all for. Not the punishments. Not the headlines. Not even the policy shifts. But that someone had seen and would remember. That evening, Celeste returned home earlier than usual. Her old house smelled of lavender and books. The walls, worn but familiar. On her kitchen table sat a box of letters. Some old, sent by friends, colleagues, former law students. Others new, sent by strangers who wrote, "You gave me a voice." She opened one envelope. Inside was a photo. A boy on a hospital bed, smiling. His father, Howard Briggs, holding his hand. On the back, a short message. "Mark says thank you. You changed his life. You saved his voice." Celeste's eyes welled up. Not from pain, but because the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the lives touched by the truth. The next morning, she stepped in front of the press. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a voice. A real one. "I am not a hero," she said. "I am a judge. A woman. Black. Strong. And I will not be silent. Because silence is what sustains impunity. And truth is what breaks it." She looked out at the crowd. Somewhere in the back, someone began to clap quietly. And this time, others joined in. Not as a performance, but as a choice. To witness. And not look away. This was not the end. This was the beginning. What started as humiliation ended in justice. But the scars, those don't fade. Not on her scalp. Not in the system. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people hear what others want silenced. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed silent or stood your ground? And if you want more true stories like this, raw, real, and rooted in justice, make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourself and take care of each other. See you in the next story.